If two grandmaster chess rivals play a heated match against each other, there's one thing they will certainly come to consensus on by the end. Who won the game? This is Data Skeptic Consensus, and the 21st installment in our series about how multi-agent systems achieve collective decision-making. And what if those chess rivals, during the middle of their match, at a random point decided to play a different game, in which they actually try to collaborate, jointly leading one randomly chosen player to certain victory? Josh Brunner joins us today to explain why even cooperative chess is hard with a capital H.
Hi, I'm Josh Brunner. I'm a master's student at MIT right now in theoretical computer science. So my research is primarily about the algorithmic complexity of puzzles and games. For example, I think we're talking about here where I proved the piece-based hardness of retro chess, a form of chess puzzle.
And obviously, I think we'll spend most of our time talking about chess, but just more broadly, can you comment on games in general? Everyone has a sense of what it is, but maybe not an appreciation for the mathematical definitions. What's a game to you?
There's many forms of it. There's simple abstract games that are like NIM or like graph games like geography that are sort of well known and studied in computer science. And there's also your traditional board games that you might play. Settlers of Catan is one a lot of people know. And chess, of course, is just a well-known game. Go. And there's also like card games. And all of these, you can actually think about the algorithmic complexity of like how hard it is to determine whether you can win from a given position or like what moves are legal from a position.
And what about chess in particular makes it interesting?
Chess is chosen in part because it's a canonical, well-known game, and I've been playing it since I was little and enjoy the game a lot. The rules are nice and simple and elegant, which makes it easy to think about. And the piece movements, there's just enough kinds of piece movements to allow for pretty complicated puzzles and positions. It's known that chess is exponential, x time complete, so you can't solve who wins a chess game in less than exponential time.
And that, to my understanding, we have that firm separation that exponential is definitely worse than polynomial. So knowing that chess is exp time, it just seems rather hopeless. Or am I looking at the situation with too dire of eyes?
That means that, yes, we probably won't ever be able to fully solve chess. This is different from, though, things like chess engines and such. What we're really doing here is showing the absolute worst case is that you cannot make an algorithm that runs reasonably efficiently that would show for any chess position whether or not you can win. But you can certainly give very good heuristics, and that doesn't prevent you from solving reasonable cases. It might only be the case that particularly bad and hard cases are actually that long.
So asking these broad questions about can this player win from this position, those have obvious value to the game of chess, and a chess player might like to have an oracle that could answer a question like that, but it's not the only interesting question. What are some of the other things one might want to know about a game of chess or a particular board configuration?
So a natural question that we ask in the paper is whether you can reach a position legally. This is a common type of chess puzzle known as a retro chess puzzle, where you get some crazy position, you say, could this position ever be legally reached? And usually these puzzles will involve some nonsense with castling or en passant, or you'll have to do this really deep calculation to figure out if the king could have legally not moved for the entire duration of the game so far. Or there might be a bishop that's in an impossible location and it could only have gotten there via promoted pawn. And these are quite interesting as just sort of a hobby to solve them, but I think our paper is the first time anyone's looked at them from an academic standpoint.
There are some things in there, I don't know if you'd use the word annoyance having worked on it, but that ability to capture a pawn and convert it to another piece certainly opens up a lot of passive exploration. Let's say a simpler game, I couldn't capture a pawn and convert that to the bishop as you described. It might be easier to say, obviously it could never have arrived at this position, but for that one weird case that you were describing, and that one weird case that we might not even see in a lot of chess games. If you want to have a complete algorithm, it certainly has to capture it. And that's one that is sort of like a point of discontinuity to me, right? As soon as that piece has changed, the rules haven't changed, but the experience of the game changes quite a bit. Are there any special things you need to do to account for the dynamics of that game? Or are you really just looking more at simulating broad sets of possible games?
For our paper and what we looked at, we didn't need any of those weird rules, actually. While they're interesting for creating puzzles that like humans like to solve, in terms of algorithmic complexity, all we need is the basic movement of pieces. We never care about pawns promoting or en passant or castling. We actually don't even use kings in the entire proof. The kings are just like left at home and we say, we don't need the kings to prove this.
And one of the interesting notes you guys make in the paper is, in particular, the mate in K question. So, given a board, can this player achieve a mate in a certain number of moves? If K is 1, it ought to be rather obvious, right? Can you force a mate in the next round? Pretty simple algorithm. But for anything greater than 1, suddenly we're in a different complexity class. So as the core of the proof is about proving that something is p-space complete, we should probably get into what that is for maybe listeners who need to remember a complexity class back in the day. Could you give us a hand-wavy explanation? What is p-space and p-space complete?
P-space is problems that can be done in polynomial space. The sort of canonical type of problem that is p-space complete is going to be a two-player game which has a bounded depth. That is, the number of turns in the game is a provable finite constant. And the reason why these games are in p-space is because you can sort of simulate the entire game tree, just like walk through every possible sequence of moves that players can do. And because the depth of the game is bounded, you only have to spend a relatively small amount of space storing the game history and the game tree.
I don't know that anyone actually implements anything with that kind of strategy per se. Maybe small, shallow problems, but you're never going to run out of memory, I guess, because you know how much you're going to need, assuming you can get it at the front end. But it's compute that, I guess, is going to grow. Is that a fair way of looking at p-space complete, or p-space in general?
Yeah, p-space doesn't put any guarantees on time. The best time is exponential time, because in a polynomial amount of space, you can have exponentially many states, and you might have to go through all of those states. Analogous to the games here, we see that, so p-space means that you have bounded depth, but a tree of height n can have 2 to the n nodes in it, and so you might still have to explore 2 to the n nodes.
I guess maybe I'm a little naive in chess here. Do all chess games have a finite ending, or can we end up in something where two lone, kings are chasing each other about or something like that?
FIDE official rules do put an end to this with things like the 50 move rule that says that after 50 moves, with no pawn moves or captures, the game is a draw. But these rules are somewhat inelegant, and it's better to, personally, I think it's sort of pure academically to remove these and only think about the game without such conditions. And so now we say a draw is just simply if no player can ever win after enough moves. Rather than putting a finite cap like 50 on it, we just say if the game would go forever, we're going to call it a draw. And now, yes, you can have states, once you remove the 50 move rule, that last arbitrarily long.
And we should maybe also review on what the completeness is in p-space complete. Hopefully some listeners know about the, sister idea of NP completeness, and I think there might be a few others of these. What does it take to prove something's p-space complete, and why do we care about doing something like that?
So a problem being p-space complete means it is the hardest problem in its class. In particular, any problem in p-space can be reduced to a p-space complete problem. So if you have some algorithm that answers a p-space complete problem, you can use that algorithm to actually solve any problem in p-space. And in particular, this means that a p-space complete problem must be very hard to solve, because we know of many other problems in p-space that we don't have any answer to, and we don't believe they're easily solvable. And since any algorithm for a p-space complete problem must be able to solve them, then also must be able to solve those hard problems, and so this problem must be very hard. The canonical p-space complete problem that most reductions eventually trace back to is the one known as quantified Boolean formula. If you know from NP completeness, SAT, which is the satisfiability problem, is the canonical NP completeness problem, which asks for a given Boolean expression, does there exist a assignment that evaluates to true? A quantified Boolean formula is similar, except that we allow a bunch of quantifiers at the beginning of the form exists or for all, and you have to ask whether this statement is true.
And that, to my ears, sounds like a very, very different problem that could we have arrived at a certain chessboard from a legal starting position. It almost feels like unbelievable that these two seemingly different ideas could be related. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the problems do indeed sound quite different at the beginning, and there is a sort of natural way you can think of why it might be p-space complete. So in p-space complete problems, it tends to be the case that one class of puzzles that are often p-space complete is one-player bounded puzzles, but allow you to reverse moves potentially. So here I'll talk about a different puzzle that I have also shown p-space hard, Rush Hour. If you know that game where you push cars around on a grid and try to get a car out. These kinds of games, you can potentially need exponentially many moves to solve them, but to like maintain a state of the board, you only need a relatively small polynomial amount of space. And the reason why they can take exponentially many moves is because you do a lot of moving pieces back and forth. And this is intuitively going to be p-space complete because sort of shuffling back and forth between an exponential number of states while maintaining a small description of each of them is like exactly sort of the hardest thing in p-space.
Even if you couldn't become more clever than that, that style of algorithm would solve all of the p-space complete problems. Is that fair?
Yes.
But somehow we get the intuition that there isn't going to be a more clever algorithm, that there is a hardest, that this is a true separation. Part of my curiosity, I guess, was around the completeness class. That you've contributed a couple now problems that these are all p-space complete. And certainly if someone solves one of them, they've solved them all. That's part of the beauty of the completeness. But just the strength of the style of proof, I guess, from a very theoretical point of view. How do these separations help us better understand complexity theory?
One of the interesting things is that we actually have very few examples of problems in classes that are sort of in an in-between level. As a general rule of thumb, if you're approaching some problem, like just, some random puzzle or algorithm or something, and you're wondering how hard of a problem is this to solve, it almost always falls exactly on one of the completeness boundaries. If your problem is in p-space and it's not p-space complete, it's almost certainly in one of the much smaller classes. Like, in particular, except for a handful of stranger problems, it's probably an NP, in fact. I do find it an interesting oddity that there's almost no problems that fall in between. Like, for example, an NP simile versus polynomial time algorithms. Basically, every algorithm that we know of is either solvable in polynomial time or is NP complete. And there's very few examples of problems that we think are both not NP complete and also not solvable in polynomial time.
Right. Do you think that we just haven't proven there's a hard division there, or have we just not been clever enough to construct the right problem that shows something in the middle?
There are a few examples of problems that are open as to which side they're in and are suspected to be in the middle. So I'm going to go with we're not clever enough yet, and we need to think about this more.
And then let's get into some of the core results around retrograde. And actually, I don't know if we've defined the helpmate problem. Can you describe the key problems you were looking at in the paper?
So the first problem was helpmate. And helpmate is the question of, can white ever checkmate black? Now, normally in a chess puzzle, when we say this, we mean with black acting adversarially to white, and white has to manage to force a checkmate on black. But in Helpmate, we're asking whether white can ever legally checkmate black, even with black's fullest cooperation.
And they're able to fully communicate and all that?
Yes. In some sense, not relevant, but yes. You can imagine each of them being omniscient and just making moves that are optimal for the position.
For this cooperative game, gotcha.
Yes.
Well, that sounds a lot easier than chess.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, it necessarily is because it must fall in p-space, whereas chess is exp time, and exp time is a larger class than p-space.
Good point. But even still seems a little harsh, right? We're trying to cooperatively arrive at an end state, and there are so many successful end states. Do you have a sense of what intrinsically makes it hard?
So yeah, you might actually suspect at first that it could be an NP, because it's not obvious that the sequence to win necessarily is really long or complicated. In a given position, it seems plausible that the number of moves you'd need to win is proportional to the number of pieces on the board, maybe times a constant or something. That seems like a reasonable first assumption. Or if there's some really long sequence of moves that's some weird counter or something where you have to move a piece back and forth a bunch, that might be easily simplifiable down to be represented in a compact form, which will put it in NP. But this is not actually the case, and what we show here is some positions that involve moving pieces back and forth in a rather complicated manner.
And can you describe a bit about that? What are these complicated, I don't know if you'd call it a dance that the pieces do that makes the problem extra challenging?
We actually have a couple layers of reduction here. I'll go ahead and describe the problem we're reducing from, which is a different puzzle game, which I also proved p-space complete, called Subway Shuffle. In this problem, you have colored tokens on a graph, and the graph has colored edges. You need to move the tokens from vertex to vertex along colored edges of matching their color, and your goal is to get a particular token across a particular edge. It's like the target edge.
Like through a turnstile.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. This problem is shown to be p-space complete, and we sort of implement this problem in chess, where the edges are going to be long lines of bishops that sort of shuffle back and forth, all blockaded by pawns that can't move, in order to free up various vertices, which now will have a like rook or knight located at them, and the type of piece located at a vertex sort of indicates its color in the subway shuffle world.
And give me a little more background on Subway Shuffle. I think it's a good game to think about in that I could quickly picture it and even maybe play it, at least on paper, with a friend or something like that. And I see some of the challenges of it. When did people start studying that problem, or were you the first person to present it?
Subway Shuffle actually came about due to rush hour. So I talked about rush hour a bit earlier. Back in like 2005, I believe, rush hour was proven to be piece-space complete. And one of the follow-up questions asked was, is rush hour, where all your cars are one by one, as opposed to being longer than they are wide, is that still hard? And the proof sort of broke, and it didn't seem easy to repair it, because there's some fundamental differences about when the cars are one by one, where things are all just like too easy to move around, sort of. It seemed too hard to actually constrain anything and make the problem truly hard. And so this problem was open for a long time, and Subway Shuffle was actually invented as an attempt to prove this problem hard, because Subway Shuffle was sort of an abstraction of rush hour, where instead of you think of rush hour as moving cars horizontally and vertically on a grid, we now take that nice grid and just replace it with an arbitrary graph, and the colors are vertical and horizontal. So Subway Shuffle was actually proven piece-space complete several years back, but not in a form narrow enough to be applicable to rush hour. And what we did about a year ago was refine that with a proof that used a much more restrictive set of vertices and graphs that allowed for it to be implemented in rush hour easily.
And having completed that work, was it a natural next step of you looked at a chessboard and said, hey, that looks like the same thing. I think I can do a reduction from the chess problem to this one? Or were you looking at chess independently and it just so happened that this could work out?
Most of this work was done during a class at MIT that was about proving algorithmic complexity of things. And one of my friends just posed a problem one week. He's also a chess player, about retrograde chess problems, and just like, let's think about the hardness of this problem. And this was actually while we were in the process of solving rush hour. We had not yet solved rush hour or subway shuffle at that point. And our first thoughts on it were, maybe we could, once we get rush hour working, reduce this from rush hour and like just implement rush hour itself directly in chess. And our first constructions had all these like crazy knight and rook contraptions that tried to mimic vertical and horizontal lines like in rush hour. And nothing really seemed to work because it was too hard to make a four-way intersection in chess actually not allow other pieces to come and go through it besides the ones we wanted.
So tell me about the construction that did work then. How do you map from the retrograde chess problem to the subway problem?
So the key thing was subway shuffle, we actually showed was hard even with degree 3 vertices. And degree 3 is like pretty doable to put in chess. Like you can, with the right choice of like knights and rooks, have a square that is attacked by 3 pieces and really isn't attacked by anything else, and all those pieces are sort of walled away by pawns that can't do anything but attack that square. And this isn't really doable for 4 directions. You can't really put 4 pieces around a square and also block those pieces off from doing anything else. And now that we have this degree 3 vertex, the rest of it was really quite similar. You just make these lines of pieces that represent moving a token along an edge, and it all just sort of works out.
So the first thing that's really clear to me about this work as a contribution is it helps give us some understanding of complexity theory. We have yet another great example of piece-space completeness and maybe some intuition about how to look at problems in the future. I'm curious if you see an impact outside of the theory. For example, I gotta believe Ken Reagan read your paper. Maybe is there some way to detect cheating in chess? Or could a chess engine benefit from some of your insights? Are there more practical advantages in addition to the theoretical ones?
I personally can't think of any. I think the main contributions of this is going to be just giving us more sort of algorithmically hard problems that we can think about other related puzzles with. I don't think this is going to have much of an actual impact in chess in a practical sense. I guess what this shows is that part of FIDE's rules officially are that chess is a draw if no player can ever legally checkmate the opponent, which is a pretty natural condition. And so normally this isn't really relevant because if no player can ever checkmate the opponent, well, one day we'll figure this out because like they'll keep trying for a while and then they'll both give up and they'll declare it a draw. But in a timed match, someone could run out of time. And if you run out of time, you lose unless the game was already a draw, in which case it's a draw. But it turns out that determining whether the game was already a draw is very hard to check. In practice, we know basically all of the reasonable positions that could be a draw or not, so this isn't going to come up in like sort of normal-sized chessboards. Our problem uses some obscenely large chessboards, and it's a bit of a generalization in that respect. There are interesting Helpmate problems on 8x8 boards, basically. So this could be a relevant topic still.
Well, it would be a fun sci-fi idea where someone wants to contest the results because you can't establish that with certainty they have drawn. But anyway, maybe another apples to oranges kind of comparison. There's been a lot of news around AlphaGo, I imagine you're at least vaguely familiar with, and its wins with both, obviously, the game of Go, but it's done very well at chess, and I think broken some best-in-class metrics there. Not necessarily following similar patterns. I know we could draw parallels to circuit complexity, I guess, but this reinforcement learning brute approach, just generally speaking, do you have any thoughts on the study of games in general? Will we start to see some sort of hybrid, or will their theory and the sort of just hammer away at it computationally approaches be going in different directions?
I feel like these are pretty separate areas, at least for quite a while. The important thing about the theory here is that we think about theoretical worst cases, and we sort of contrive extremely silly positions and very weird instances of your problems, whereas chess engines are sort of a much more practical aspect. In a normal game position, can it do something reasonable? Chess engines aren't really guaranteed to do something reasonable if I give you a board with 30 rooks on it. They have no reason to have ever seen that before or do anything sensible in that kind of position.
Yeah, good point. Complexity problems are really about all cases, not the average case, per se.
Right. There is some work on average case complexity, but it's not an area that I work on or study much.
Well, with that in mind, I'm curious about where you're going next. Do you have any specific areas you're researching you'd want to share about, or areas of interest you hope to get into?
So I'm still working on right now a few other puzzles and games. There's some research in progress about the card game Teach You and its algorithmic complexity. I've been doing some work on the card game Dominion and hopefully going to show a piece-based completeness for whether you can win this turn via some nonsense with the card contraband, if you ever heard of it. In particular, it allows the opponent to make a decision during your turn, and the ability to have both you and your opponent making decisions is a good way to get piece-based hardness. Dominion as a game is quite hard to think about algorithmically over multiple turns because of things like shuffling and pile sizes and people's hands and decks, and there's a lot of places cards can be over multiple turns, whereas over a single turn it's a lot more doable to think about because we can often restrict to a case where you've drawn your entire deck into your hand, and so I don't have to think about where your other cards are and what's going to happen between shuffles or anything like that.
So does that mean, broadly speaking, you're interested in games? Is that where you'll focus in terms of your interest in complexity theory?
Yes, definitely my favorite thing is to take various games and puzzles and try to prove algorithmic results about them. I've also done some work in just sort of more pure algorithmic complexity problems like some SAT variants and such, and I do find those pretty interesting as well. But my favorite problems are definitely the ones that take games that I'm familiar with and apply algorithmic results to them.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work here. This is really interesting.
Thanks for having me on, Kyle.
That concludes this installment of Data Skeptic Consensus. Our guest this week was Josh Brunner. Claudia Armbruster is our associate producer, Vanessa Burciaga does guest coordination, and I've been your host, Kyle Polich.